Hello everyone. We are here and ready for week 6 of our Gradations course. You can see behind me that I finished up my red blocks for my Christmas quilt. Because I used red fabrics and not a gradation fabric, I still decided to grade my colors from dark to light. So if you're using your own fabrics, you have lots of choices on how to lay out your blocks. So I love using my K-Facet design wall in order to put my design up on that wall so I can see what it's going to look like in a quilt. This K-Facet design wall, I do have a YouTube video on how to make one of these design walls, and it's just made from insulation. Here in New England, we have really thick insulation panels at Home Depot, and then you can go ahead and cover it with the K-flannel to make a beautiful design wall. Mine is hanging from the ceiling, so I can go ahead and move that around. And this is covering over a closet area, so it gives me lots of extra space to work with. But let's get back to gradations. This red gradations quilt, I've put the darkest colors up in the corner, and then I've graded the fabric down to this bright red down here. Now because I'm going to make this into a large quilt, I'm going to make 4 of these panels, and I'm going to put the darkest color on the 4 corners. So these will rotate around when I have all 4 together, and my brightest colors will be in the center of the quilt. So I'm excited about that, and it's going to take me a few years to get this done. So today I'm going to show you how to piece the blocks using the red blocks, but then we're going to switch over to our black gradations quilt to show you how to put the borders on your quilt. So I'm going to put the glow line tape at 7 1/8, and if I just stretch the glow line tape really tight, I can get it right across, all the way across on those 1/8 inch markings. So the reason why I'm marking 7 1/8 is because it's half of 14 1/4. So this will mark the center of my quilt block. So you have to decide where you're going to be looking at that tape. I don't want to look at the far side of the tape. I want to look at the tape that's closest to the 7. That's 7 1/8 right here, 7 1/8 right here. So this inside corner where they cross should be the very center of my block when I'm squaring up the block. Now I don't go by the flower when I'm squaring up the block. I actually go by the outside edges, because what I need to be able to do is put the 14 1/4 measurement, and you can measure that also with your glow line tape. That 14 1/4, you can mark that with your glow line tape so that you don't get mixed up with your measurements. Totally up to you, but I like to mark any measurement I'm looking for with my glow line tape, and that helps me to keep everything consistent. Now we always say measure twice, cut once, but if we measure once here and mark it, we're not going to mistakenly look at the wrong measurements. So here's my 14 1/4, and then I've got 7 1/8 marked as well, and the glow line tape is a great product to do that for you. So now this 14 1/4 inch square has to fit within the edges. We cut our blocks at 14 1/2, but now we've done all of our decorative machine stitching. That block has shrunk in just a little bit, so if you measure it, it's probably not 14 1/2 anymore. So that's why we are now squaring this up to be a perfect 14 1/4 inch block. What we're trying to do is center this ring within that 14 1/4. Now there needs to be at least 1/4 inch here, and 1/4 inch here, 1/4 inch on this side, and 1/4 inch on this side beyond the ring. But you're going to find, because it's shrunken in a tiny bit, there's a little bit more than 1/4 inch here. So you want to center it so that the ring is the same distance away from this edge and this edge. So you're going to see 1/4 inch and then still a little bit of white before your ring begins. The other thing you want to make sure is that you're not twisted. So you're going to make sure that you're taking off the same amount across this way and down this way, and it's not tilted on your ring, on your square. So I'm looking at all 4 points, all 4 1/4-inch markings to make sure that I've got a 1/4 inch plus a little hair on all 4 sides. Now that little hair right there, when we sew our 1/4 inch seam and you sew that seam and then you press, it's going to look like this block and the next block come right against each other. There may be a tiny little bit of white showing, but I'd rather have a little bit of white showing than have my melons cut off here when I'm sewing them together. So I'll show you that when we go to sew them together. But right now I just want to really look at squaring this up and making sure it's symmetrical, and I've got a 1/4 inch plus a hair on all 4 sides. We've got a nice straight line here and a nice straight line here. Let's cut off the excess. Now the best way to do this is on a small mat that you could now rotate so that you could line up the other 2 sides. But I don't have a small mat that I can rotate. My rotating mat is too small for these big blocks. So let's go ahead and just rotate the block. Now that edge that you squared up, the edge that you cut, is going to go right against that 14 1/4 inch line that you marked with the glow line tape. If you didn't mark it with the glow line tape, double check to make sure you were on the 14 1/4 here, 14 1/4 here, and now we're going to just trim up those last 2 sides. There's not a lot to trim, so you have to make sure with your first cut that the entire 14 1/4 is on fabric, so you have just a little smidge to cut off when you're squaring it up. Now that is a perfect block. Once we have all 9 blocks trimmed up like this, then we're going to put them together into 3 rows of 3. We'll do that next, and we'll show you which direction to press your seams. The way that I put my blocks together is I'll lay them all out flat like this. And now I'm going to put block 1 to block 2. I'm going to put block 4 to block 5. And I'm going to put block 7 to block 8. So I'm going to take this one and put it right sides together. And then I'm going to pin this edge together. Let's get this next one up and we'll do the same thing. So these 2 together. Now we're sewing along this edge. So if we do all 3 at once, we can pick them up in order. So we are going to put our darkest one through the machine first, and then this one, and then this one. I'm ready to sew my blocks together, but I just realized I still have my walking foot on with the open toe. This is the foot that I use for all my buttonhole stitching. So the open toe allows me to see right where I'm sewing for buttonhole stitching. But now I need my 1/4 inch foot on. So this one with the little bar has exactly a 1/4 inch. I can position my needle so the needle is exactly a 1/4 inch away from that little bar. So let's get that onto my sewing machine. And then we'll be adjusting our 1/4 inch perfectly so that when we sew these together, they're going to go together really, really easily. When you are testing out your 1/4 inch, I know on my sewing machine exactly where I need to set my needle. My needle needs to be set at 6.0 with this particular foot. When you're first starting out and you're learning how to piece accurately, you want to test your 1/4 inch seam. The way I test my 1/4 inch seam is I sew together 3 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide. So I'll cut 3 squares or 3 strips at 1.5 inch wide. I'll use my 1/4 inch seam or my 1/4 inch foot to seam those 3 pieces together, and then I'll measure the middle piece. If you don't have exactly 1 inch, you're going to repeat that over and over again until your machine is set up so your needle is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge of your foot, and when you sew, you're going to get a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Now on this machine, I'm going to sew with my feed dogs, my walking foot engaged, and I have an integrated walking foot on this machine. That's going to come in really handy next week when we go ahead and quilt this quilt. But I use it for piecing as well. That helps your fabrics go in from the bottom and from the top at an even rate. So when you're using your walking foot, you're going to get more accurate piecing. I always take my pins out as I come up to that pin. I never like to sew over the edge of the pin. So we're just going to keep feeding our blocks through. Now whether these blocks are 14 1/4 inches like these, or they're 1 inch blocks, if you are extremely careful keeping your edges exactly together and you're feeding them in to the machine very, very carefully, so you're keeping an exact 1/4 inch, you're going to have precision piecing. Now these are nice big blocks. If you're not confident with your 1/4 inch seam, it's not going to make a huge difference with these great big blocks, but it will make a big difference when you're doing small blocks like those 1.5 inch strips. So the more practice you get keeping a perfect 1/4 inch seam, the better. Now we have a lot of experienced quilters in our group, and we have some beginners. So I like to go over these fundamentals of piecing with a 1/4 inch seam with every single course that I teach, because I'm not going to assume that even my experienced quilters know the importance of a 1/4 inch seam, but in quilting it is the most important thing you can do is to practice and perfect the 1/4 inch seam. So now I'm here at the end of my row of 3. I like to keep them together. If you keep them together, they can get a little bit tangled up, but I really like keeping them together. So what I like to do is open them up wide like this, and then I accordion fold from the bottom up so that I have all 3 layers like this. And now I'm going to add my last row of 3. So back on the wall I have my last 3 blocks, and we're going to be sewing with the dark on top. So we're going to take them in that order: dark on top, or the top block on top, ending with the bottom block. That gives me 3 blocks to add to my 3 rows. This was the top block, and this is my top row. So I'm going to take the top block, add it to that row, right sides together, and we're going to pin, and we're going to pin. Now I'm only going to pin 1 on at a time, because remember these are all stuck together with that thread in the middle. So I don't want to pin all 3 unless I had space to really spread out. I could spread these out on my table and add all 3, but I'm going to add 1 at a time. So I'm just going to sew block number 1, and the easiest way for me to do this is to put these blocks on my lap. That way, that accordion fold that I make can unfold as I put this through the machine. So you could use a little side table, but I like to just put the blocks right on my lap here, get that first one ready to go through my machine, and just sew on that first pinned block with a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Always take out my pins as I go. I don't want my pins to get caught in my machine, so I never ever sew over my pins. Now remember, I've got 2 more blocks over here. So I'm going to finish this first block with a beautiful 1/4 inch seam. Okay, before I get to the end, I'm going to lay out the second 2 blocks so they're nice and flat on my table. Grab that second to last block and put it together, right sides together. If this is confusing to you, what you might want to do is sew those first set of blocks together and then cut them apart where those strings are connecting. Put them right back up on the wall so you can see your design again just as it was. Even take a picture of how you had your blocks arranged so that you know you're going to get them into the same order again. But if you're really methodical about the way you pick them up and you're labeling, you can even label them with sticky notes so you have them in order. You can keep them in order fairly easily when it's only 9 pieces. Now this gets more and more complicated as you have longer and longer rows. So if you're going to do a queen size quilt like I am, I like to break it up into sections. So I'm going to put 9 blocks together. Even though I'm doing a queen size quilt, I'm going to do 4 sets of 9. So as I'm finishing up one block, I'm getting ready to feed in this next set of blocks, and I'm going to add that last one, and I know it's the right one because it's the bright red. So I'm going to add that one right sides together. Make sure you're matching up your ends exactly and your sides exactly. Even just a hair over or under, it won't make a big difference on these great big 14 1/4 inch squares, but we have to practice our precision piecing, and it would make a big difference on smaller squares. So practice makes perfect. Practice every time you sit down to piece. That perfect precision 1/4 inch and your edges being lined up perfectly, and you're going to be a better quilter every single time you sit down. Okay, as I get towards that end, make sure the ends are lining up and finish off that row. Okay, why do I keep all of these strings together between the rows? These strings act like pins. They keep everything in the right order, so when I rotate this work and I'm going to put this row to the row next door, these little strings line up those seam allowances, line up those seams, so that I know exactly where they go together. Nothing gets twisted or turned. So now when I go to put the 3 rows together, my first row, I'm going to put seams down on top. The next row, I'm going to do seams up. And then the last row is also going to have seams down. That way, at these intersections, I'm going to have opposing seams. One seam allowance goes down. One seam allowance goes up. We're going to nest those 2 seams together and pin that seam. I like to pin on both sides of the seam so it keeps them nested together. Then we're going to go back up to the very end, pin our ends, pin the 2 seams and the 2 ends, and you're going to have perfectly pieced blocks. Once you have all 9 of your squares together, you're going to measure from edge to edge and get your personal measurement. Your quilt overall should be 41 3/4 inches. If your measurement is different than 41 3/4, you're going to take your measurement and divide by 2 to get the size that we're going to cut these borders. At this point, we're going to take all 4 borders and we're going to cut those borders down to 20 7/8 inches. So the first thing I do is I make sure that border is nice and straight by using my ruler to square it up that way. Then I'm going to measure 20 7/8 from the fold and cut off that last little bit of the selvage edge. You're still going to end up with a little bit of white selvage on there, but it's a slight amount. It's going to be within your seam allowance. We're going to cut 4 borders this way, and we still have 2 more border strips that we had cut at 3.5 inches. With our 2 remaining borders at 3.5 inches, we're going to square up one end of that border. It's still folded, so we have both colors in the gradation on that fabric. So now that I've squared up the end, I'm just going to flip it around here, and we're going to cut 3.5 inches in this direction as well, from the end of the border, not from the folded end. What we're looking to do is from those 2 extra border pieces, we're going to get 2 squares in 2 different colors from each piece. So we're going to have 4 squares, 2 purple squares and 2 red squares on this gradation, but whatever colors are on the end of your gradation. After I've cut off the squares from the end of this extra border piece, remember we cut 2 extra borders, but all we need is these squares. Now we're going to take that extra border piece and trim that down to 2.25 inches, or whatever size you like for your binding. I like to make my bindings 2.25 inches. So we're not wasting these 2 extra borders. We can add this to our binding. I now have my quilt folded up so you can see where I've added the 2 side borders onto the quilt. I have the purple with my purple block, but on the other border, on the other side, I'm going to start with the opposite end of the fabric. So if this top border has purple on the right, then the bottom border has purple on the left, and the red is on the right. The reason for that is you want your colors to travel around your quilt gracefully. So now that I have my side border, I've lengthened it with that 3.5 inch square on the end. Now I have all my purples matching together. I don't want to put my red up here because it's disjointed that way. So I've pressed my seam toward the border. That means this seam is pressed in this way toward this border, and I now have nesting seams here on the corner. I'm going to put a pin in right there after nesting those seams together. Sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to nest the 2 on the end as well. Everything lines up beautifully, and it's so easy to put these borders on when we've pre-measured everything. And now this beautiful Gradations quilt top is complete. I am so happy that you have joined me to learn how to use your Leaves Galore Petite template to make this absolutely beautiful quilt in just 6 weeks. If you are ready for a more challenging quilt and you would like to join our My Magical Garden or Belle en Rouge course, those 2 courses are both available online.